Thank you for waiting. Panel discussion will start. Power system reform for integration of renewables. Whilst I introduce the panelists, then there will be short initial presentations. Mr. Professor Toshihiro Matsumoto of the University of Tokyo. He has been engaged in the system reform from the beginning. He is a member of a large number of committees and commissions. Professor Matsumoto. Thank you for the introduction. I am Matsumoto, Tokyo University Research Institute of Sociological Science. First, about the Energy Basic Plan. As you know, the renewable goal by fiscal 2030 is 22 to 24%. As Mika Obayashi mentioned, at the moment, it is now about 17% or so. The basic plan was made before the major disaster, and it was based on the nuclear ratio of 50%, and the renewable goal was 20%. But then after the Fukushima and the disaster incident, whilst the nuclear is going down, renewable goal by fiscal 2030, 22 to 24% only. Isn't that too small? That is our feeling. Why such a limited goal? That is because of the cost restriction. To expand renewable, it's not the generation cost, but it's about the interconnection grid cost. The transmission cost is going to be expensive, and they could not raise their goal. 22 to 24% of renewable. It was close to 10% before the disaster in 2011, but those were major large dam hydro. So the goal of 2030, 22 to 24 is so small. So by fiscal 2030, to raise the goal of renewable, to make the renewable one of the core source of energy, the total cost has to go down. Otherwise, Japan's goal cannot be more higher. So cost reduction has become more important, not only pressing down the generation cost, but the grid cost, the entire interconnection cost has to be pressed down. Reforming the electricity system is ultimately for that purpose. That is not the only purpose, but the system reform has to be useful to bring the cost down. So what has a social value? There must be appropriate compensation, and if there is expense required, there must be appropriate shouldering, burdening of the cost by appropriate parties. As a result, a socially valuable system has to be deployed. Reforming the electricity system is for that purpose, and to reach a low-carbon society by 2050. Electrification is required widely throughout the society, and therefore electricity system reform is, after all, energy system reform. One important point is, like carbon pricing, that there must be clear pricing. At the same time, the system reform is equally important. When there is a larger amount of variable renewable, social cost could be different by a factor of 100,000 depending on the time and season. Like a hotel that costs 1,000 yen per night, it is going to be 100 million yen per night. So that is going to happen in the different utility prices going forward. To continue to consume utility at the same price, it's going to be too expensive, and about connection to the grid. Unless 100% of capacity is maintained, interconnection is not possible. And on an annual basis, if the deficiency is only 1% or 0.5%, interconnection refusal just because of a lack of stability, that is nonsense. So at the reasonable cost, at the lowest possible cost, realizing a decarbonized society should be the aim. Multiple markets are being established. Making market is not the aim of the system reform. As I mentioned, what is most important is that there must be fair compensation and a fair sharing of the expenses and investment to make a fair market. It will not be successful just by making markets. The careful design, if there is a mistake in the design of the market, is going to be disastrous. Mr. Shimomura mentioned that curtailment is occurring, which is causing lower price. And the wholesale market, the price did not go down to zero. There was quite a controversial discussion at committees and commissions, and it is moving very slowly. But this kind of system must continue. The legal unbundling is only midway, and we still have a long way to go. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Professor Matsumura.
続きまして
Thank you. Let us now introduce to you Mr. Ryoichi Kunimatsu, General Manager, Japan Electric Power Exchange. Since the establishment of the JEPX, he has been watching the development of the market. Thank you very much. My name is Kunimatsu of JEPX, and I'm honored to be part of the panel this afternoon. I did not prepare any handout, but to date, under the electricity system reform, it's been mentioned that market has given much weight. We run the spot market, and the volume is in between 30 to 40% of the total demand. If we compare with other countries, the volume has increased to the extent that it is at par with exchanges in other countries. But if we look into detail, gross bidding increase or indirect auction, to a certain there's a limit to what interaction can be used. So there had been a 10% increase, but because of the transitionary measures that had, in a way, artificially increased volume. So volume has increased, but the substance hasn't really caught up with the increase in quantity. With the exchange, in collaboration with the Electricity and Gas Market Surveillance Commission, I believe that exchange itself is being required to make efforts to entice the healthy expansion of the market. So we are only at the starting point, and we need to further brush up our efforts. Further, the relationship between our exchange and renewable energy, we are running the non-fossil market value exchange. But so we've been successful in separating the power value versus the environmental value, but it's still difficult to understand and complement it. We need to simplify so that the environmental value is justified and more fairly evaluated. By separating this with the power value or power volume, we've been successful, but under the current design, retailers are required to come up with the environmental value. And I think that makes the system rather difficult. For example, in the case of coal thermal power plants, you don't need to purchase the power from such thermal power plants. And by operators purchasing, the margin of cheap coal thermal power generation can be used for investment in environmentally free power generating facilities through carbon pricing. So far, any kind of power is sold at our market, but LNG thermal versus coal thermal, if we compare power generated, LNG thermal is better in terms of the lowness of emission. We need to promote the spread, but there's no difference as long as the trade occurs at the exchange and coal continues to survive. partly because of the cheap cost. Of course, survival of coal in itself may not be so bad, but we're wondering whether we can design a system where there is heavier load. For example, the emission coefficient at 0.4 could be fixed as an obligation. Operators who operate at 0.7 would have to purchase 0.7 from someone else. Then the 0.4 efficiency can be established as a coefficient through the trade at the exchange. So that kind of pricing-related rules could be contemplated to be imposed by the exchange in order to improve the functioning of our exchange so that we can contribute to the realization of a sustainable society. That's it from me. Thank you.
国松様ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Kunimatsu. Next speaker is Mr. Hiroshi Okamoto, Executive Vice President of TEPCO Power Grid Incorporated, about unbundling and as variable renewable is rising from the perspective of the transmission operator, Okamoto-san. Thank you for the introduction. I am Okamoto, Tokyo TEPCO Power Grid. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. As Mika Obayashi discussed, I am at TEPCO Power Grid. We are a transmission and distribution operator. As is shown in this diagram, backcasting. On the right-hand side is 2050. Towards decarbonization by 2050, what do we have to do? It is sort of backcasting. Right at the moment, there's a lot that we have to do, but I will start from the future and go backwards. By 2050, what happens to supply and demand? 2.5 years ago, there was a publication, and the data comes from that publication. As Professor Matsumura told us, on the demand side, transformation will occur. So what was fossil will now be electrified, and in particular in transportation and in heat, there will be electrification. As electrification spreads, when energy efficiency improves and population goes down, energy demand would decrease. But in transportation and heat, if electrification is going to expand, there could be a rise in power demand. Well, when we talk about this, we may sound funny when population is declining, but that is not the case. Looking at the final demand or primary power consumption, this is the transformation occurring. And on the side of the power generator, this is rather old simulation, but the renewable and more distributed renewable source, that share will become much larger. So the supply and the demand, both sides are going to change significantly. Then how to match supply and the demand as they are both changing. That is the important role of our company doing transmission and distribution. Again, this is the estimate of 3 years ago. According to the estimate calculation, CO2 emission goes down by 72% on the right-hand side, and by fiscal 2050, the government goal is not achieved. So we shall have to recalculate and re-estimate, or more effort is required. Electrification must expand, plus the power generation. It should be non-fossil as much as possible. But those two are important, by no mistake. There are two challenges. One is the supply demand. They have to be matched all the time. That is the characteristic of electricity. But if you try to match supply and the demand, first of all, there's temporal time mismatch. For example, the solar, if it is sunny during the daytime, there's solar, but the consumption time is during night. Or during the rainy season, there is no power generated, but there is demand. So there is a temporal time mismatch. How to match the mismatch? So flexibility was discussed by Matthew in the keynote as well. By the middle of this century, like 2050, it has to be drastic. 80% must be reduced. So the supply-demand balance during a summer season, electrification is expanded. So the demand is expanding, which is the vertical axis. This is just a kind of an image type of graph. At the summertime, when demand is high, renewable, if it is expanded, there will be a surplus of power generated. And then EV is going to be very useful to close the mismatch of the time. But still, there will be power surplus, according to the estimate. Plus, if hydrogen is used, then the surplus can be converted into hydrogen that could be further used for generation. Or in other words, there are situations where there is a deficiency of power. No matter how much EV is used for charge and release, or no matter how pumped water is used, there must be a backup by thermal. There are instances where there is deficiency. How to ensure supply reliability remains to be the challenge. I mentioned about the temporal time mismatch, and the next is the spatial mismatch. For example, if renewable is expanded, in the metropolitan region, is there a big potential? After all, there's quite a potential on the northern part of the archipelago, like where it is marketed by Hokkaido Electric or Tohoku Electric. There will be more interconnection. So there is a spatial mismatch between supply and the demand. Professor Matsumura just spoke to us. First of all, optimization of grid utilization to use the same system and to allow the highest level of matching. Connect and manage. We have started with the guidance of the central government and OCTO. Plus, for different location, different timing, there must be dynamic pricing and distributed generation is spreading. What market is appropriate? That also has to be considered to optimize the use of interconnection, and the optimization of capital investment. Master plan has to incorporate decarbonization, and plus communication amongst all stakeholders are required. Then, investment for the next generation has to be implemented according to the plan. I had to rush through, but we understand the important role to deal with the time temporal mismatch, which is ensuring flexibility, and how to deal with the spatial mismatch, which is optimization of the grid use, optimization of capital investment. These are the challenges for our company. Thank you for your kind attention.
皆様ありがとうございました。
That was Mr. Okamoto. The next speaker is Mr. Keiji Kimura, Senior Researcher, Renewable Energy Institute. At our institute, he does research on cost and market integration. The floor is yours. Thank you. My name is Kimura, Senior Researcher at the Renewable Energy Institute. Now, the title of this symposium is Power Market Restructuring for Renewables Integration. But rather than reform, I will focus on renewables or decarbonizing the society and improving cost efficiency to realize a decarboned society. And for that purpose, what should be the policy to increase renewable energy, and in market design, what are the key points that need to be kept in mind? To promote higher proportion of renewable energy to decarbonize the society in a cost-efficient manner, FIT had been introduced in renewable energy, but in the future, renewable energy has to show its own potential and values in the free market. That would be required. And one means to achieve that status is being done in the debate for the revision of the FIT system, and that is the debate over FIP, feed-in premium. However, renewables integration through a market where there would be trade over powers from different sources, that should lead to the reduction of total cost. But from the renewable generators' viewpoint, there would be factors that would increase the costs rather than reduce the cost. One, they have to sell their power, so they would be exposed to volatility of pricing, and volatility risk would rise, which means higher financing cost for the generators. And that would increase rather than reduce the generation cost. And so far, 100% of power produced had been automatically purchased, but they have to forecast the amount of supply themselves and sell in a planned manner. And when imbalance is generated, that imbalance would have to be settled. So they would have to create various systems to enable that to happen and assign people, which would also lead to increase in the generation cost. So we are trying to minimize the generator's cost, but there are factors that would increase the cost. So that would have to be taken into consideration when the design for the FIP system is considered. And in the market, in order to enable smooth trade between powers from different sources, the market has to be well developed. Renewable, especially PV and wind, that are intermittent and variable, until immediately before it goes to the market, they cannot accurately tell the amount of wind and sunshine. So forecast with higher level of precision and last-minute balancing would have to be different, would have to be done. So intraday market becomes all the more important. And in Japan, we have to thus take into consideration those factors in the design of the intraday market, and also some kind of hedging means for the pricing mechanism is necessary. So for renewable integration into the market, another thing that needs to be prepared on the market side is a point that was mentioned by a few other speakers as well. As we try to promote decarbonization, the social cost of CO2 emission has to be priced properly in the market. And from such perspective, if we take a look at the Japanese market, global warming tax exists, but in comparison to other countries, the level is low. So if we do a comparison of carbon pricing, that could become a key. Non-fossil value market has been introduced, but there's ambiguity as to the legally binding nature. And as Obayashi-san said, the capacity market is important, and it will offer an important signal to the capacity market. So if the design is done in a way that incentivizes higher emission, then that's problematic. And especially with regards to the capacity market, for example, in the UK, there's a mechanism that would foot the brake, and that is in the form of emissions performance standard. So if the CO2 emission exceeds a certain threshold, then that could not be traded. UK is used as a model for Japanese policymakers, and those points should also be taken into consideration. That's it. Thank you very much.
それでは
The fifth panelist, Professor Hiroshi Takahashi of Tsuru University. From the very beginning of the system reform, he has been involved. What market ought to be, the role of the players. He is very well known for a lot of his recommendations. Thank you, Ms. Kudo. I am Takahashi from Tsuru University. There was reference to the expert committee on the electricity system reform. My respectable Professor Matsumura and Dr. Hatta, I have also been on the committee. We started 7 years ago, and we have come quite a long way. I think there has been positive changes. There are lots of issues, so I will only focus on the illegal unbundling of generation and the transmission. Why? The objective. The primary objective is to liberate the monopolized network. After all, it's about liberalization. So it is going to be liberalization, but the transmission network, it has to be made available to the new entrants. Otherwise, it would not be liberalized. But the monopolized network, the former 9 incumbents, the ownership will continue. And therefore, there must be the separation of the legal ownership. Ownership separation is ideal, but in the case of Japan, they are private sector industry, so it has been decided that it is going to be legal unbundling rather than ownership unbundling. TEPCO has already done so. By the end of March of this year, all other companies, other incumbents other than TEPCO, also have to unbundle. But this is not sufficient. So the Surveillance Commission will have to carefully monitor whether it is done appropriately. Expansion of renewables, and this unbundling is expected to contribute to further introduction of renewables. In a sense, it could be neutral to the power mix, but energy transition is what has to be promoted. And if the rules are going to be unreasonable for renewables, that cannot continue. There must be fair treatment of the renewables. That is why we are trying to reform the first-come, served rules. And on top of that, flexibility has to be expanded, which is not a simple liberalization. All these are important. So distributed power generation reform is how I call it, and in particular, Europe is advanced in this regard. The second objective also has to be kept in mind. At the moment, lots of preparations are done, and we are waiting for the April timing for the unbundling. There are 2 challenges. Number 1, Mika Obayashi already spoke about this, about the legal unbundling, the holding company system and the parent company being the generator and the distributor. In the case of Japan, either can be selected. Not much discussion at the expert committee on reform. I had expected that most would be holding company, but that was not the case. Most of them were that the parent company would do the generation and the sales. RTE of France, the closed French system, why people copy that system? And German Transnet is different. The parent is the holding company. But after all, like TEPCO, I think holding company would be much better. That would enhance your corporate value, I think. And then the trend of the transmission operators. In the case of TEPCO, I'm not trying to praise TEPCO, but in Chiba, the connect and the manage, I have to praise you. That's very good. Compared to Europe, naturally, it may be lagging behind, but in Japan, it is very advanced. And I spoke with TEPCO, and they are preparing for the second and the third phase expansion. That is very encouraging. At the same time, new interconnection has to be invested. Use maximum of the existing interconnection, that's important, but new construction is also required, especially in Hokkaido and connection between Hokkaido and the Japanese mainland, Honshu. New investment is required, and who shoulders the cost will be the challenge, and therefore a new cost sharing mechanism across Japan has to be discussed, which is being discussed and is encouraging. Going forward, what will happen in the future? I'm always using German example, sorry, but what happened in Germany after liberalization? Just to look at the lesson, there was a full liberalization of the retail market, and from 2000 there were major mergers and acquisitions, which Japan can learn a great deal. There were also 10 vertically integrated private power companies in the past. They were the incumbent, but after liberalization, the yellow part, it was reorganized into 4 organizations, which was quite a natural movement because it was liberalized. The regional monopoly collapsed and regional competition was introduced, and this took about 10 years in Germany, which is interesting for Japan. Initially in Germany, it was only legal unbundling, which did not promote competition, and BNets R and EU third package was introduced. Yes, and the legally unbundled transmission, the name was the same with their parent, like RWE, Transport Net, or a Nets, and the corporate name was changed, and it became Amprion or Transpower. And finally, ownership unbundling happened with the 3. And ENBW, they are still only at legal unbundling, but at least the name is Transnet BW. So what happens whether it's the holding company type or the generation and the sales type after the legal unbundling? There are 4 scenarios. Either even the company name will be different, or if the company name remains the same. In the case of Japan, many are in the third box, and TEPCO Power Grid and Chubu Power Grid is on the left-hand side above, and Transnet BW, as I mentioned, they are holding company, and the 2 have different. He's off the mic. Ownership separation. The goal is to be clearly separate, so there must be clear separation of generation and transmission. Conclusion. I strongly expect good advancement by the Japanese operators to maximize the value as the transmission operator, as a TSO. This is only natural, and I hope that they will be very thorough.
欧州の送電会社なんかはもうみんなそう。
The European transmitters, they have gone as far as ownership unbundling. Number 2, Octo is working hard here in Japan, but still long way to go. There must be more wide area interconnection across Japan. First of all, what about Octo only for the transmission operators and ISOs? Nationwide ISO could be made in Japan. Why not? It's a possible idea for Japan. Number 3, as I mentioned, merger and acquisitions, in particular the transmitters, the TSOs. There must be mergers and acquisitions. Otherwise, a fundamental wide area operation cannot spread. So TEPCO, I encourage you, please do go in this direction so that the Japanese transmission will be resilient, strong, and it will be optimum nationwide. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you, Takahashi-san.
たくさんの
Thank you for listing several items. We would like to now begin the panel discussion. Mr. Shimomura of the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy will also join. We ask the panelists to come up to the stage.
パネルディスカッションのモデレーターは自然エネルギー財団事業局長大林美香が務めます。
The panel will be moderated by Mika Obayashi, Director of the Renewable Energy Institute. I give the floor to Mika. Thank you. Let's begin the panel discussion. We can continue until slightly a few minutes before 5 o'clock, and we will be hosting a reception after 5. But until then, we would like to converse on various issues that have been raised. All of you said what you'd like to say, and the details or major structural reform that needs to take place in the Japanese market had been cited, and I asked Mr. Shimomura and Matthew to initially deliver short comments on their impression. First of all, may I ask you, Shimomura-san, to deliver your comment after you've heard the many speakers? Thank you very much. I took 20 minutes when so many authorities of the subject are here, so sorry for having been given so much time. We call it reform. We haven't completed that reform. Just because a regime has been established, that doesn't mean that we've been successfully completing the reform. Fine-tuning and continuous fine-tuning will be necessary. And the more we go ahead with reforms, the more challenges we begin to encounter and the things we need to do mountain. So how do we harmonize between conflicting challenges, and how do we coordinate with the market? The temporal mismatch was cited, but taking into consideration the time lag as well as other challenges, we need to come up with the optimum system. And what needs to be done, I think this kind of gathering where many ideas can be presented is very useful. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak one more time. I feel like I had the most time, so I'll keep it very brief. I'll only say perhaps one thing. It came up a few times in the comments earlier, and I think it's really worth emphasizing, that really the focus needs to be on outcomes most of all. So when you think about market reforms, we've heard there are many different models. Even within Japan, you're beginning to see different models emerge between different types of unbundling. This is not unusual. You see this in Europe as well and in the United States as well. In the end, what matters most is that the outcomes are beneficial to Japan as a whole and to Japan society. So if you are not seeing renewables increase in penetration as rapidly as you would like, or the costs come down as fast as you would like, then you need to look at the models that have been employed and ask the question, have they been chosen correctly, or are they fit to the purpose? So it's always worth having these discussions about what is the choices are being made and asking the question, do those choices actually lead to the outcomes that Japan wants? I think what I'm hearing is that this is being considered, that this is not a final choice, but that they're being constantly being sort of reevaluated. But it's also really important to remember that you can't stop that process. You need to continue to evaluate, but also stability matters too. So it's not change for change's sake, but to ask the question, what do we want to achieve? What changes can we make today to better meet those goals? And so what I'm hearing, I think, is the right steps forward. But obviously more work needs to be done. So perhaps I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Then I would like to ask a few questions to other panelists as well. Sorry to suddenly appoint you, Okamoto-san. TEPCO in 2016, very at an early stage, did the unbundling. 4 years have passed. How do you evaluate the effect from the transmission operator perspective? Sorry, my name is Okamoto. Suddenly, a very difficult question, and so many proposals were made and suggestions were made by other speakers on that subject matter. I'm not sure how I should respond. Yes, as many as 4 years have passed, but the road has been bumpy. If we look at the value chain and look at the factors separately, one by one, there are several challenging. The relationship between holdings and our group operating company, in terms of governance and division of role, there are overlaps and there are loopholes, and there could be such concerns. But on the positive side, we were established as one company called the TEPCO Power Grid Incorporated. So the management of our company was able to focus on what value creation we ought to do as one independent company, which requires mid to long-term vision. And we had to think about the system. Many stakeholders related to the transmission and distribution business. How do we sustain the manpower and human resources? There's the business sustainability and social sustainability, and we were given the opportunity to think about those opportunities, and we were able to think how we can establish independence in the management as one entity. We are still faced with challenges, but in this environment, we are making step-by-step progress.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Professor Matsumura had recommendations. The cost of renewable has to go down in order to massively deploy and expand the use of renewables. That is also our recommendation at our institute. The transmission cost also should be included, and the overall the cost of deploying renewable has to go down. Mr. Shimomura also discussed, and Mr. Okamoto also said in his presentation, there is the spatial mismatch. By different location, there could be a concentration of renewable generation. And if the interconnection, it has to be strengthened. And then about the transmission interconnection strengthened within that location. And that purpose is not only for expansion of renewables, or it is like matching the places that are conducive to renewables and the priority of transmission, like ENSO that is done in Europe. That has to be done. But in the case of Japan, maybe that is not being implemented. What is your observation?
まず、
The overall cost has to go down. The generation cost, transmission cost, they have to be considered in total. If there is a certain place where the renewable is abundant and the cost is low, and expanding renewable as much as possible, is that optimum? Even if there are poor conditions and the generation cost must be high, but if the transmission cost is more appropriate and if the cost is lower, then it should concentrate in that area. If a place has low demand, then transmission capacity has to be expanded. But is it efficient to transport electricity by transmission or changing the location of demand? Not mandatory, but then that place would enjoy a low electricity price, and then people might relocate to that place. By thinking about all the combination to lower the overall cost is important. So not starting from where which location is conducive to renewable, that is also important, but the master plan has to consider the overall cost reduction, which is not being done. With the traditional way of thinking, if they wanted to interconnect, then new investment is required to interconnect. And if that investment cannot be shared, they were rejected and could not connect to the grid. That should not be the case. For Japan as a whole, when renewable is becoming as large as this, investment in the transmission, if it is most efficient according to the master plan, that is the response to the challenge by Mika Obayashi. Yes, master plan is being mentioned at the council, but unfortunately, we do not have the master plan that is a real master plan. So we have to overcome. The system reform should enable us making that required master plan.
まあちょっとなかなか
Thank you. The reform has only started, so under the very nascent situation, to what extent can we do? The proportion of renewable is very low. Shimomura-san said 50%. If you had said 50% by 2030, then where are the best sites and how can we minimize costs? That kind of debate would could be spurred. But without such short-term targets as long-term targets, I think it's difficult to consider to what extent can we increase renewable. Sorry, again, to you, Shimomura-san. In the Council, master plan has been discussed several times, especially from the transmission perspective. And the optimal site for renewables and comprehensive mapping would become required. But if we look towards the mid to longer horizon, in what way does METI think about the master plan and optimization of the master plan at your ministry? First of all, we need to improve the level of the master plan. The one we have only says more renewable energy, and if there are several applications, then the applicants bearing certain cost and create transmission network. Those projects are popping up here and there, but they are time consuming and they would become a network with various seams, piecemeal without being seamless. So pull to push, we call it. We have to think about a nationwide transmission network that would be ideal. And I think it's the job of the national government to define such an optimal network. That sounds nice, but we need to think very deeply if we want to implement such program. How will power demand change in Japan? Is it going to go up or go down? It's very difficult to foresee future demand. We've created railways and roads, but traffic could come down. And who built this highway without so many cars being driven? And with electrification of vehicles, there would be various spots that would be able to charge, and we may end up not needing transmission networks. So if we think about the total cost, we need the benefit to outsize the cost on the part of the variety of stakeholders. Currently, the main players are TSOs, but the national government should take the lead to do cost-benefit analysis for different stakeholders to create a better master plan.
Thank you. Earlier, Mr. Kunimatsu discussed, for example, the emission trading on the exchange. There was an interesting possibility mentioned. Indeed, under the current exchange system, coal is very cheap, and that would be traded on the market. Or even if carbon tax is introduced, still the system is that the coal price goes down, and therefore the cheapest coal will be traded before other fuels. But if the emission is fixed and the emission is traded, Mr. Kunimatsu and then Dr. Kimura, in that order, please. Yes, I discussed that. Coal and gas thermal, when that is compared, coal is advantageous. If you just look at the electricity exchange, coal is advantageous. By the exchange making rules, I think my idea would be possible, but there must be coordination, negotiation with a large number of stakeholders. But whether this is good or not only talking about idea, there must be more careful analysis. But I think it's going to be useful. On top of that, in the case of Japan, what to think about CO2 emission? So to attach the efficient coefficient to the power and then sell that to the user. And when the operator changes, even the coefficient changes, which is very difficult to understand. And reselling, by repeating the resales, the emission coefficient is non-trackable. In order to overcome these challenges, first of all, the accurate collection of the emission is required. The generator must recognize the accurate emission that they are causing. That is required to manage CO2 emission.
In the exchange, do you have a debate on the probability of realization? Well, but there are people who are against such ideas, so we need to proceed carefully. Did you know about that, Okamoto-san? No, I'm not well versed with the details, but just to add one point. Retail, from the consumer's perspective, make things comparable and transparent. That's one of the keys. In our case, from our perspective, one request, it's not directly about your personal project, but in the exchange, many initiatives are underway. But at the final consumption phase, choice has to be made with lowest emissions. So I mentioned electrification, but electricity emissions coefficient versus combustion of fossil fuel, that has to be the direction to where we need to make the shift. Then we've been also taking up the issue of carbon prices. In the case of FIT, the high price of renewable energy is being borne by operators, but the denominator should be different. I think the sector at large should be bearing the burden. So this may be part of what should be referred to as energy sector reform, energy system reform, but sector decoupling also should be taken into consideration.
Thank you, Dr. Kimura. Thank you for the question. Carbon pricing, the selection, choice of the final consumer would be one factor. And then on the side of the generators, the behavior of the generators, how to guide them to low carbon, decarbonization. In that regard, carbon pricing will be increasingly important. Under the current Japanese market, indeed, FIT, the FIT market, there was the special measurement law for renewables. As a result, indeed, renewable is expanding. But at the same time, the fossil power, what incentive is provided to fossil use? In fact, it does not reflect the huge amount of carbon consumed because of the system. So how to reform this aspect, I think, is important. In that sense, the wholesale market per kilowatt hour, how to price carbon in the wholesale market, and I mentioned about the capacity market. Just because there is a value with the capacity, participation is not allowed, but the initial investment, which is the initial investment into the generation capacity, there the carbon pricing also has to be reflected. Otherwise, despite generation, if it cannot be sold, then that would pose a trouble for the generators. So capacity market has to be designed carefully, and the wholesale market also has to be designed with all these incorporated. So a kind of a design with totality is important. Thank you.
Thank you, Takahashi-san and Professor Matsumura. What do you think about what was suggested? Carbon prices factored into the market. Professor Matsumura suggested something like that in your presentation. In the power market, factoring in such mechanism, that's one idea, but the other idea would be full introduction of carbon tax, although it's been partially introduced, raise it significantly, or emissions trading. Promotion of emissions trading would lead to the original nature of carbon pricing. And related to the point made by Okamoto-san, to date, utilities thought only amongst utilities, gas, people only thought from the gas perspective. And even when separated from the climate change perspective, we shouldn't divide. Rather, through sector coupling, people have been advocating electrification, but those silos will be broken. And I think in the future, that kind of integrated will come about. So we have to think about the total energy system and think about how best we can factor in the carbon pricing to avoid the deformation of the market. It's easier said than done. There are different interest parties in the industry, and our organizations were built in silos to begin with. So it's not an easy task, but yet we have to look at the overall system when we think about optimization. Of course, the ministry has to be with that line of thinking. So does the industry. So in a cost beneficial matter, decarbonization could be promoted.
私は普通に
Carbon pricing or carbon tax, I agree with that. Even if it is not done by the exchange, I purely think there should be a carbon tax. But then that cannot stop the use of coal. It depends on the percentage. But even with a reasonable level of carbon tax, it is not easy to stop the already established coal thermal. But for the new planned, the carbon pricing, if that can be deployed, we can significantly stop the freshly planned coal because there will be initial investment, and if they become aware about the continuous permanent carbon tax. So we have to commit to the introduction of carbon tax as quickly as possible. And carbon tax, considering the electrification, it should cover all emissions, all fuel, of course. But it's not only carbon tax, but there could be a surcharge of renewables. Why only the users? Because it should be applied to all types of energy. From RPS, I have been advocating for long, but not being adopted at all. So high hurdle. I'm just hitting the wall and no one listening, and I cannot break the wall. But I'm sure that I have to continue to shout. But with electricity alone, if carbon tax introduced, that's the worst case scenario. But the tax revenue, that can be used to reduce the surcharge for the renewable, then that can reduce the hurdle against electrification. So carbon tax only applying on electricity, that could be problematic. So there is opposition, but that should not be the case. I'm sure that there are lots of ways to go around. So step by step, no matter what, we have to promote the introduction of carbon tax, and many people will have to continue to shout.
Thank you. I thought your suggestion is interesting. We've been debating on carbon pricing for 2 decades. Carbon tax has been introduced only at very low level, and there is no prospect for emission tax. Tokyo Metropolitan Government is thinking about the possibility, but the exchange could do it on its own as the initial stage. That's interesting, but there are companies that have introduced internal emissions trading. Many companies have shown their intent. Company Kao has made great strides. So your idea sounds interesting. In this context, there could be different viewpoints, but with people talk about the increase of the proportion of renewables, but there are many pending issues that have been unsolved. For example, basic rate of power generation, that's become one of the debate issues. Kimura-san, any comments? We have several panelists amongst panelists, and there is no renewable operator amongst the panel, so you're the only one that can speak from the renewables operation point. And Matsumura-san, I've been listening to your view as a colleague member of the council, but could you comment? Well, I was unprepared for such a question, but the generator's basic rate, I don't think it's such a bad idea. But as mentioned by Mr. Okamoto, location, what do we think about the future of transmission infrastructure? on the assumption with increase in renewables, what would be the design of the optimum transmission and distribution network? The generators site-specific characteristics, or with in order to maximize the efficiency of interconnection and choosing the sites that would lead to that, I think basic rates to a certain extent contribute to the realization of such programs. So I don't think the concept in itself is bad, but in comparison to Europe, the level of basic rate that's put on the table at the moment seems to be higher than the level in Europe. So, can we suddenly, in just one leap, set such high level? And also, if it's just kilowatt-based pricing, of course, there are those who say, yes, it has to be based on kilowatt because the objective is interconnective efficiency. But there are those who say that the transmission volume should be controlled, so kilowatt-based. But connect and manage is another idea. It doesn't then necessarily have to be on kilowatt basis. To develop the interconnection network. So kilowatt-based billing alone, is that sufficient? That's my question. So the price level per se, is the level appropriate versus the system of prices? Are we just going to be singularly basing the price on kilowatt? So that's another question.
Mr. Shimomura? Thank you. The surcharge on the generators, as was discussed, the generation and the cost of transmission and the distribution, I think it is one means to minimize the cost. The transmission distribution cost, the access charge, the retailer has to shoulder 100%, which is the user's charge, kind of the tolling or the access charge. Looking at other countries, the generators and the retailers, both sides have to pay. Of course, it depends on the jurisdiction, but there is a shift of burden also to the generators side as well. That is the trend in the other countries. In the past, it was not liberalized, and as demand increased, the utilities had to construct the generation and also invest in the transmission. That was fine in the past. But unclear about the demand, about the renewable is increasing. And because of the renewable expansion, there must be more investment into the interconnection and the transmission. And according to these changes, the utility charge system also has to change. The rate system also has to change. At this moment, the congested area, there is generation made, or even in uncongested area, the same cost is required to construct further generation. So there must be distinction. And this is the system for that. So in the uncongested area, if it is constructed, then there could be a discount. So they connect and manage. And in certain cases, there will be curtailment. Then the basic rate could be discounted. There could be multiple policies considered. In the past, there must be continuity and consistency with the investment made by the large incumbents in the past. Thank you.
At our institute, we did a study, although it's still preliminary, but there are many countries that don't impose cost on generator for renewables, and some countries have like a threshold of 100 mega. So I don't think we can simply say the majority of countries have generators price or cost. PV, in the case of PV, the burden is overwhelmingly large. So I think there's still room for more creativity. For example, basic rate versus volume-based rate could be one option. So we hope that debate can continue. We have a few minutes left, so as long as the questions are short ones, we can entertain 1 or 2 questions. Those of you who have questions, please raise your hand. If we see no hand, we will immediately ask the panelists to make further comments. But any questions from the floor? Was that a surprise? Did it come up as a surprise? Did I get you unprepared for such a request? But if you don't have any questions, if none of you, oh, I see a hand at the very back. Please identify yourself and your affiliation, and please be brief. I came late, so I didn't listen to the earlier presentations. Direct current superconductivity transmission is an area I have great interest. The power loss is 0, and the network can go around the globe. And for every 20 kilometers, liquefied nitrogen recycling pump, as long as that's established, it could go around the world. Can I have your question? Thank you. At your institute, are you taking up this technology? You mean our institute? Or are you asking Okamoto-san as a transmission operator? Can you respond? In Hokkaido, aren't you doing an experiment? Very shortly on superconductivity, we have been doing research for several years. And this is AC, but 60,000 volts or 160,000 volts at the substation. As you have pointed out, loss is minimized. Loss is low, so very little heat. So in narrow line, power can go through, and it's better in DC. But one challenge is cooling, the issue of reliability and cost projection. So there is hope for this emerging technology. But personally speaking, if superconductivity can be realized without the necessity of cooling, it will be a completely different story. But there is no superconductivity at room temperature. Then it could become as surprising as optical fiber.
ではそちら
Just one more question. Please tell us your name and affiliation. Right in the front, please. Please. My name is Morita Akihiko at Miyagi Prefecture. I used to teach at the university in Miyagi Prefecture. Question. I am not an expert, but going forward, when market mechanism is reformed, forecast of the future is important. As Mr. Shimomura discussed, going forward in Tohoku region, in depopulated area, what will happen, or declining fertility and population decline. When model is developed, decentralized distributed power is the base. So the assumption of the model must reflect the public opinion. Otherwise, the Japanese population will not accept. What is the observation? Generation volume plus transmission volume? Yes, that has to be considered in totality. It's difficult to forecast about 10 years or 20 years in the future. Who makes the forecast? And how can the Japanese population be aware and accept and agree with the future forecast? Mr. Shimomura, maybe? Thank you for the question. That is a very difficult question. Even now, something like a master plan does exist, which is at the OCTO. There is the Committee on Wide Area Transmission Development, a forecast about the demand increase or the forecast about renewable increase. So in a particular place, that the interconnection, if that is expanded, would that be cost beneficial? Yes, there is a public committee, but I think very few people in the general public might know. I mean, on the panel side here, you may be aware about this committee, but not very well known amongst the Japanese general public. So how can we listen to the voice of the general Japanese people and reflect in the master plan? That would result in higher quality master plan. That is an important challenge. Thank you very much.
A different example about offshore wind. There are regional councils with the participation of ANRI or experts. Can that be done in the interconnection lines or transmission network? Could those groupings be established? In the council, in those regional councils, I think it's about optimization of the micro, but how can we do an optimization from the nationwide network, not just from the renewable energy perspective, but from cost perspective, and to what extent is it possible? That's a difficult point.
ございました。
Thank you very much for the questions from the audience. Lastly, I will invite the panelists here on the mid and long-term perspective. On the short term, what is required? It is like a backcasting. So renewable, a large amount of renewable has to be connected to the grid to realize decarbonized society. For the ultimate goal, what should be done now on the short term? That would be the final comments I ask you, like 60 seconds each. Quite a long time of 60 seconds, starting with Professor Matsumura. Right at the moment, what is most effective is, I think, connect and manage and the non-firm connection. TEPCO, not only TEPCO, but it should spread nationwide.
Thank you. Takashi-san. Super short term, I would agree to that idea. But if we think about a longer short term, then my subject this afternoon, unbundling transmission and distribution, the first step could be legal unbundling, but the Surveillance Commission should be thoroughly monitoring the unbundling to optimize the transmission operations. Then that would also include the possibility of connected management, and that's the key for this particular year.
Thank you, Mr. Shimomura. At the last part of the presentation, I mentioned not only renewable or not only reducing CO2, but supply stability. And the stability also has to be considered because loss of power because of dependence on the renewable, that's a trouble. So resilience also is important. So distributed network has to be expanded and Japan's backbone has to be made resilient. Those would be the most important in the short term. Thank you.
Thank you. If we think about the mid to long-term horizon, what needs to be done now? Now, thinking about the mid to long-term goal and thinking about what we need to do now, tasks that are time-consuming should begin early. So what are task-consuming tasks? One is a transmission line system to be established, which takes time. And one is change of energy mix, which takes time. So in order to ensure an ideal energy mix, policies have to be designed. And in this context, the issue of master plan was raised. For mid to long-term decarbonization, what kind of transmission and distribution investment would be necessary. We have to begin thinking now, or else we won't be there in time. And another factor that impacts energy mix is carbon pricing. That has to be done now, or we will not be ready in time in the mid to long term. So those are the 2 points.
Thank you. The short term, after all, renewable to become the major energy, then the renewable operators need to be able to forecast their generation capacity, and if they deviate from the forecast, how to adjust. As much as possible, the generators will have to adjust when the forecast was wrong. A thermal or fossil, just like that, it should be adjustable. And by realizing that, how to expand the renewable, I think, is critical. On the demand side, the changes in terms of kilowatt, the solar accounts for a large amount of kilowatt, and then it must be by hour. When there is no sunshine, then it depends on other energy. No matter how much solar there is during nighttime, there is no sun, and fossil will have to be used. And wind that even operates during night, that is the only way. But how to price that so that can be incorporated in FIT, plus by FIP, by feed-in premium, and the demand should be balanced according to the price. As it should be the retail price linked to the exchange price. Then that there will be a dynamic demand, and whether it's cheap renewable, that would be used more. And then by kilowatt hour, then renewable will account for a larger share. These, I think, can be deployed immediately. So I think that would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. Renewable operators doing generation projections in the case of Spain to a certain extent. Iberdrola came with the generation projection for aggregation wind, but in Japan, solar PV has come in. So to a certain extent, a group has to be formed, and the renewable, the utilities also have to do the forecasting too. Is that the point? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, a few comments. First of all, at our company, Connect and Manage was mentioned, and indeed, yes, we shall work hard on that. As quickly as possible to connect to the network and to participate in the market, to make it very smooth, to facilitate the participation in the market, that would be important, so we shall do that as quickly as possible. As Dr. Kimura mentioned earlier, and there was discussion about master plan, it is also relevant with that. In order to decarbonize from a bird's eye view, I mean, it's subject to change. There are multiple scenarios, but how will supply and demand change for decarbonization? There must be a thorough communication amongst the stakeholders. And on top of that, what should be done right now has to be initiated. In Europe and the United States, there are lots of discussions. So today we have this symposium, but in Japan, there is not enough discussion in the first place, and not much active discussion yet in Japan. So, including ourselves and together with all of you, we want to have active discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now conclude this session. Once again, can we thank the wonderful speakers with a round of applause as they descend from the stage. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Again, our appreciations to the panelists, and you may return to your seats. Thank you for your contributions.
以上をもちまして
This is the end of the Symposium, Power Market Restructuring for Renewables Integration. We will have a small reception in the same room at the back of the room. Refreshments and snacks will be served. Please stay on if you have the time. Please leave the simultaneous interpretation receivers on your seats, on your chairs. Again, thank you very much for coming.